Welcome to Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. State and federal decision makers have put college programs that focus on minority and disadvantaged populations in their crosshairs. The COVID pandemic, a 2023 Supreme Court decision, and now a concerted effort by the president have taken their toll on Native American studies programs at colleges and universities. As the annual American Indian Studies Association conference begins, we'll ask Native scholars and students what the future has in store for a Native-led academic focus. We're back after the news.
This is National Native News. I'm Antonia Gonzalez. Search teams working on missing and murdered Indigenous people cases must prepare themselves for the likelihood they'll come across a body. One group based in Portland is proactively preparing volunteers for that encounter. Brian Bull of Buffalo's Fire reports.
Inside an anatomy lab, William Borman, professor of basic sciences for the University of Western States, carefully turns a cadaver over on a metal table. A tinge of formaldehyde fills the air. 7 volunteers with the group MMIW Search and Hope Alliance examine its tendons, nerves, and organs.
I thought this was a nerve.
This is a nerve right here.
Kimberly Linning is the group's founder. She says she's seen death up close many times.
And I think through my years of traumatic experiences with violent death, I've seen a lot. It's prepared me, I think, just through the fire. Like steel is forged through fire.
But for most people, exposure to death and corpses isn't a recurring thing. So Linning reached out to Borman to arrange a visit. Not only does it gird people for when they find a body, but it helps them discern between human and animal remains. 2 volunteers, Sabrina Griffith and Isabella Regalado, said they would recommend this experience.
The veins, the actual ligaments, the muscles, it was quite surprising to see it and feel it in real life. I've only touched bones and stuff like that, so it's very interesting to actually feel the inner part of our body.
It's actually been better than anticipated. I thought it would be a little bit more gruesome, but everyone has been very professional and understanding and doing their best to educate everyone else.
Linning and Borman remind people that viewing cadavers isn't the same as coming across a corpse, whether that's in the wilderness or city. Such bodies aren't preserved, and beyond what the cause of death inflicted, would be subject to the elements and scavengers.
If it's in the wilderness, in the forest, bears, cougars, wolves, they're going to tear at stuff and leave the bones. So definitely pieces more than together.
Near the end of the visit, Borman sprayed a blue hydrating liquid to keep the cadavers from drying out and developing mold. He said everyone in Linning's group was respectful and asked great questions.
I'm pleased that we were able to make this happen. If she were interested in doing it again, I'd be open to doing it again.
Linning and her volunteers gave small gifts of gratitude to Borman and thanked him for his time. MMIW Search and Hope Alliance is preparing for 2 search efforts in the next few weeks. For National Native News, I'm Brian Bull in Portland, Oregon.
An Irish language activist has won a landmark decision in Northern Ireland following her arrest during a protest. Joe McPullen has more.
74-year-old grandmother Moira Vicanali attended a peaceful protest in support of the Palestinian people last August in Belfast. She was among those arrested under the UK's controversial terrorism laws because of her T-shirt. During the arrest, English-speaking police officers were unable to understand her as she gave them her address because she spoke in her indigenous language of Irish. The police ombudsman ruled last week that the arresting officer should have taken reasonable steps to arrange a translation service, and that Vicanali experienced, quote, oppressive behavior. The police watchdog also issued a policy recommendation for future engagements with Irish language speakers. Vicanali's lawyer says this decision, quote, puts a marker down for how the police service must respect the Irish language moving forward. For National Native News, I'm Joe McPullen in Ireland.
And I'm Antonia Gonzalez.
National Native News is produced by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation with funding by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Tribal Development Partners, helping tribes build toward their goals through 105L leasing and essential facility development, empowering sovereignty, strengthening community. More at tribaldevpartners.com, proud supporters of this show.
Hear that? Tribal college faculty do so much, one can't say it all here. Nothing but respect. Visit mostthoroughdjobdescription.com. The American Indian College Fund supports this program.
Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.
This is Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. College Native American Studies programs are engines for Native-led research. Since the 1960s, Native Studies scholars have helped tribes, Native organizations, and the mainstream public better understand Native issues. At the same time, they are equipping generations of young people with skills they need to be leaders. There are indications that the 2023 Supreme Court decision upending affirmative action and the Trump administration's focus on unraveling diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives are eroding all minority enrollment in higher education. As the American Indian Studies Association conference gets underway, we'll assess the power and challenges of college programs focusing specifically on Native issues. Of course, listeners, you can join our conversation. Call us at 1-800-996-2848. How have Native American Studies courses helped you better understand Native issues? How did these courses set you on your career path? Let us know. We're at 1-800-99-NATIVE. Joining us now in our Albuquerque studio is Dr. Suksavan Kiavorabuth. She is an assistant professor of women's and gender studies at Northern Arizona University and the president of the American Indian Studies Association. She is Dene. Suksavan, hello, and welcome to Native America Calling today.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Joining us from Albuquerque on the phone is Allison Shaddix. She is a Native American Studies PhD student at the University of New Mexico, and she is a citizen of Cherokee Nation. Allison, hello, and welcome to you too.
Shio, Sean, thank you for having me.
Shio. Also joining us in the Albuquerque studio, we have Mario Atencio. He is a Native American Studies PhD candidate at the University of New Mexico, and he is Dene. Mario, you've been on the show before. Welcome back, and thanks for coming into the studio.
Thank you. I appreciate the time.
And joining us from Lawrence, Kansas, we have Kelly Nalani Beam. She is a PhD candidate in geography at the University of Kansas, and she is also Dene. Kelly, hello. Welcome to Native America Calling.
Hi, Sean. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you and all of our guests on the show today. And Suksavan, I want to begin with you. The American Indian Studies Association is meeting this week in Albuquerque. What is foremost on the minds of members as you convene?
Yeah, I think I'm really excited that the conference is happening. It's an annual conference, and as the president, I think one of the things is that, this is my first year as president, but also it's a lot of work to plan a conference, then run an association, and we're gearing toward 501c status, etc. So it's kind of exciting stuff happening for ASA this year and the upcoming years as it progresses forward, and possibilities of moving to different universities. I don't know if folks know that it's only been at UNM and ASU, Arizona State University, back and forth every year. And so we're trying to branch out and make sure that AIS as a field, as a discipline, is seen at other institutions. So I think that's one of the bigger things that we're really excited about this year. But I don't know if folks know, but this past year, Dr. James Wrightington, who was one of the co-founders, passed away. And so this year we really centered this conference around honoring his legacy in AIS. And I think this is the perfect opportunity for us to start having these conversations and talk about the impacts of AIS, NAS, whatever we want to call it, right? In our lives, right? And the very real impacts that we have with the political climate happening today.
Well, I imagine a lot has changed perhaps since the last conference a year ago. I'm thinking about maybe policy issues, funding. What are you most interested right now in addressing with regard to just some of the current issues that we're all facing?
Yeah, so thankfully with ASA, we have a private grant that we have through a foundation, which has been really helpful for us to sustain ourselves, but also registration and memberships. We charge for that, but we try to make sure that it's equitable across the board. So we're trying to make sure that community members are involved, et cetera. But I think with this political climate, more than ever, we've seen at institutions, predominantly like public institutions, right? Cutting funds and the government cutting funds to programs. And so it's really like trying to find those allies in our communities to privately donate, or the private funds, those private foundations that have been the real people who have been advocating for us on the side that don't have to go through those barriers of saying yes or no, like the government, right? And so it's been kind of difficult in that regards, but I also think this is also the time where it's showing that we can never rely on this government system.
Sukhsavan, a Supreme Court decision ended affirmative action as we know it a little more than 2 years ago. Are you seeing an impact with Native enrollment in higher education because of that?
This is a great question because at Northern Arizona University, but I think across the board, not just at NAU or just in Arizona, but we're seeing, I think, just a decline in institutions in general. But I think that the support for Indigenous students in particular is declining because of programs getting cut. So we've seen at other institutions, their Native American cultural centers or like student affairs centers, et cetera, are getting cut because those are seen as DEI work. And of course, we have advocates in the institutions that are saying, no, we're not DEI work, right? Indigenous peoples are political status. And so how do we begin to understand that and dissect that with the institution of what the administration is doing, and they're playing their own games, right? And so I think it's really important that we're seeing, one, trying to see how we can support our Indigenous students. But I think that's a major factor is like when these programs or these types of support systems are cut at the institution because they're seen as DEI, students don't want to attend because they won't have the support systems, right? And so there's definitely that connection, and we've seen that across the board, or the hiding of those programs so students aren't aware that they exist at institutions. So I've been seeing that a lot, and seeing students in particular. I mentor about 10 and more students, particularly Indigenous, queer and trans students who don't feel seen at the institution because of all of these type of cuts. And so a lot of them are like, what's the point of going to get a degree or higher ed if I'm not going to be supported, right? And we're doing the institution a favor, so they should be doing us a favor. And I think those are the conversations and like things that I'm hearing from students and even faculty and staff of like, if we're not being supported either, how are we supposed to do our jobs, right? And it's a lot of work on our ends, I think.
And Sukhsavan, how do you respond when you hear students express being discouraged like that and having these doubts? What do you tell them? How do you reinforce or build them up and tell them, hey, this is worth your time. Invest in your education.
Totally. And I think, one, I think we have to realize, like, as Indigenous peoples, I think there's unfortunately always barriers. But I think, two, there's this growing network of Indigenous scholars who are out there that support and care for Indigenous students. And I always tell students, always gravitate toward the Native American Studies or Indigenous Studies or AIS programs at their institutions, because that's where the faculty, Indigenous faculty usually are, to help support them in any regards. And I also inform students to consider minoring in or majoring in AIS or NAS, because there's just a community, and the work that we do in those classes are very critical and foundational and applicable to what we want to do, right? And I think a lot of my work, I think, is very unique to NAS or AIS, because I do urban studies work, and I look at why Indigenous people are living in cities, and I look at gender, sex, and sexuality, and so how do we understand Indigenous genders, etc. And I think having more of those opportunities really engage with students, and I think that is a lot of them I've seen this semester in particular, and this semester just started, seeing the interest. I teach an Indigenous feminisms course, and a lot of them have been engaged, and they read half a book a week. So I'm seeing that they're like, last semester, I don't know what was happening. There was something in the air, and I'm sure other people in this space can attest to it. But this semester, I think, because of the harshness of last semester and last year with the political climate, I think this year everyone's like, we have to do something, and it's time to engage in Indigenous feminist theory or Indigenous theory, right? Because I think that ultimately will help us. And I think I try to inspire students to think about these systems and think critically. And I think a lot of them have been recently more intrigued by it and more inspired by not taking down the system, but how do we combat these systems that have been harmful, right? So I think that's kind of how I've been informing students, is like, we all as Indigenous peoples have a sense of belonging and power in a particular way, and it's been, I think, helping them find that is what has been really awesome in this position.
Right on, right on. The American Indian Studies Association annual conference taking place this week in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Native American Studies programs, they help a lot of Native students. I remember when I was a student in the early 90s at UNM, the Native American Studies office, I was sharing with some of our guests before the show started. It was like a home away from home. It wasn't just about the academics. There was also support there. You could talk to people. You could meet with friends. There were always dinners and lunches and activities going on. It was just a great place to convene. And we're going to talk about the significance of these programs and how they've been impacted over the past year. And of course, the phone lines are open for those of you who would like to join us. 1-800-996-2848. Give us a call. Caribou herds in Alaska are declining, and Alaska Native groups and conservationists are worried a new momentum for mining and drilling adds irreversible new threats. We'll take a look at the landscape for this important and unique species in Alaska and the factors that play into their survival on the next Native America Calling.
Support by the American Indian College Fund. The American Indian College Fund provides millions of dollars of scholarships to thousands of Native students every year. Tribal citizens of every age and experience are eligible. The deadline for applications is May 31st, and you can find everything you need to apply at collegefund.org. That's collegefund.org, or by phone at 800-766-FUND. Education is the answer.
You're listening to Native America Calling, and we're talking about Native American Studies. If you have a Native American Studies degree, tell us why learning about the world from an Indigenous perspective is important to you. How do you use what you learned in the work that you do now? You can give us a call. The number is 1-800-996-2848 or just 1-800-99-NATIVE. Allison Shaddix is a Native American Studies PhD student at the University of New Mexico. She joins us now in Albuquerque. And Allison, tell us more about the role of Native American Studies in shaping academic narratives in both university settings and also the broader community.
Yeah, absolutely. So with Native American Studies at UNM, I think it's really, really special. It's more than 50 years old now. It's kind of started in 1970s, but more as a student affairs kind of area. And it began out of student activism during the American Indian movement. And for a while, we didn't get our first minor degree until 1999. And then it finally became a department in 2018. And now we have, a BA. We have a BA to MA track. And then there's a MA to PhD track, I believe, for now. But we're in the third year cohort for our PhD program. And I'm just really lucky to be in this program, to be able to combine, I am the only Cherokee Nation in my program, but it's so cool to be able to learn from my other colleagues, from their worldviews, from their tribal worldviews. And the professors, I think, are just the best in the world here, more than likely. It's all interdisciplinary studies in our faculty, so there's really just a class for everything, ethics, tribal, IRB, community engagement, the list goes on. So just so excited that the conference is here this year. It was fun going to ASU last year, but our department is just so supportive in the student research of what we want to do. Actually, I'm going to sit for my comps very, very soon here in March, and sitting down with my committee. It really was just so amazing. So it's still Native American Studies books and the authors that we've read, but I am allowed to bring my Cherokee Nation worldviews into my question. So that just meant the world to me. Can you repeat the second part of the question, Sean?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, what is it about Native American studies that drew you to this discipline? And I imagine you had a lot of options in undergrad, but Native American studies, it stood out for you. Why?
Mostly it stood out because I have a master's in Indigenous Peoples Law from OU, and I was missing a part of it, right? Like just the whole circle of understanding of Indigenous ecological knowledge. What does it mean to study Native American studies? What is Native American studies? And I think with each student that comes in, we each find something that stands out to us. For me, it's really growing up in Texas. I was taught in Texas public schools, so my knowledge about Indigenous peoples, even my own family's history, was construed, right, from the colonial point of view. So being able to learn the truth through the eyes of the people that lived it is just, you can't beat it. It's the best program. Mm-hmm. And to combine all the things together, to make the whole circle, to be able to research and grow Native American studies as a scholar it's such a fledgling field that every scholar that passes through any Native American studies, American Indian studies program is going to put their mark on this study.
Now you have already, such impressive academic credentials, and now with a Native American studies PhD, a doctorate, how are you going to be able to apply all of this experience, all of this knowledge into what you ultimately do for your career?
So funny thing, Sean, I actually work in grad studies at UNM. I just got this job, and I'm finding that the Indian Student Service Center here is really, really good. And I would love to be able to shift into that department once I get a couple more years underneath my belt in graduate studies and really hone in on graduate students, Indigenous graduate students, and just really helping them to find the resources they need for funding, scholarships, what is available to them for grants, grant writing workshops, things like that. So I'm actually kind of doing that now for all students, but it would be awesome to kind of shift the focus into a department at some university down the road. I actually love to go back to Tahlequah and work at Northeastern University.
Oh, yeah. That'd be wonderful.
Yeah, make my way back home.
Now, Allison, we were talking earlier about some of the challenges right now, some of the issues with regard to what's happening in colleges, universities, institutions of higher learning. And do you have concerns or maybe even optimism right now when it comes to academic freedom and what that means for you and other Native scholars?
So I can't speak to other college campuses in their Native American Studies department, but our Native American Studies department, we haven't changed anything. If not, we're growing. We just hired Dr. Daphne Littlebear as a new professor. and just having even just a third year cohort for PhD. So I think we're just honestly beginning to grow. We haven't, to my knowledge, maybe Mario can speak to this, I haven't seen them change anything or like lack anything for us, for the students, unless there's things going on behind the scenes I'm not aware of. But our professors are just kind of, going forward, full momentum,
Mm-hmm.
We haven't changed too much, I don't think. I know UNM, we've unfortunately had to change a lot of our language on the website, like UNM as a whole. But Native American studies, we're pretty much doing what we were doing before the Trump administration. So I'm optimistic.
All right. Thanks, Allison.
Sure.
Mario, anything to add with regard to any changes or any challenges right now you folks are facing with regard to academic freedom?
Yes, thank you. And when the Dear Colleague letter came out on February 14th of 2025 through the Office of Civil Rights, it was immediate shock, because if you read the letter, it really attacks DEI, or we're saying JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. So it's an anti-JEDI letter. And for myself, it raised immediate red flags. And based upon that, I tried to get a collective of Dene Navajo student leaders to write a letter directly to the Speaker of the Navajo Nation Council, saying that there's probably there's potential for incredible damaging effects on K-12 programming like Title I impact aid monies and or scholarships. And we saw that tribal colleges and universities ultimately came under attack lately. And so through funding cuts, and even now I think there's banned words like indigenous communities, people, and Native American. And so that's on the federal grant side. So we're based upon this, through that letter, the Navajo Nation Council took immediate action through its Health, Education, Human Services Committee. Dr. Andy Nez, a UNM alumnus, and Speaker herself actually started lobbying efforts to get clarity of what was happening nationally with these efforts. And so it showcased how student activists, such as myself and the very courageous undergraduates here at UNM, actually reached out to the tribal leadership to demand action and clarity. And this leads over to, and then we started organizing with our brethren and sistren within the Chicano studies. Shout out to them, they're listening right now. We created a organization called Equitable Alliance of Multicultural Organizations, called Te Amo. So Te Amo means I love you in Espanol. And so here we're creating, trying to create mutual aid and support to actually combat what this is happening. And locally, and the UNM, they changed language in the human resources language. They struck out DEI from everything. We used to have a convocation, but now it's a graduate celebration. So those words have meaning. Convocation having a really big, heavy, heavier than celebration, in that we always forget that institutions and American Indian Studies count tribal nations as their constituents. And the millions of dollars that flow from tribal education departments into institutions need to have a deeper consideration than other soft monies that may come in. So that's a brief frame of what we were, how we were acting, and graduate students.
That's helpful, Mario. And Allison touched on some of the history with regard to Native American Studies programs earlier, and I'm interested in learning more. Mario, maybe help us understand more about the historical significance of Native Studies programs and where they fit in tribal sovereignty movements.
Yes, from its inception, the termination period with terminated tribes, such as my good friends up there, Menominee Nation. That termination period sparked reaction by national associations like the New Mexico Indian Affairs Association, which is now SHWEA, Back then, they organized Kiva Club, UNM Kiva Club students in 1958 to actually start youth councils or student forum groups. This ultimately led to regional Indian youth councils, which led to the National Indian Youth Council. And so it was college students independently fighting for treaty rights, and from there created the Red Power movement. And so through that activism it completely changed the nature of how tribal governments and peoples started to perceive themselves. So it stems all the way down from that termination period and searching to actually engage and try to find new ways of actually responding to those, really damaging and racist federal policies, that a whole new way of realizing what that power means partly stems over to young people. And so we always forget that it's the young people that have an immense amount of power, because they probably can still dream. As we get older, we get more conventional in our thinking. I'm trying not to, BB, but I guess that's its roots, is that we always place trust in the younger people to take action and move things forward.
Yeah, that's some good history to learn. Really appreciate you sharing that, Mario. Now, you've been on the show before, and you've talked about land conservation, and I'm interested in learning how that passion of yours relates to your academic pursuits, and just overall how the knowledge you gain from Native American studies helps you relate to the broader world.
There is an immense amount of philosophy in the land that can't be understood, incomprehensible and incommensurate with Western ways of thinking. That deep power from not Sun or Mother Earth and Father Sky is something that is quite unique. It's a unique way of viewing the world, and that is immensely valuable in these times when we're seeing, at least I think Mario Laurie was singing in the 60s of a delamination of this power system that kept us down for so long. And lately, all of these actions that are happening in the world, it's only seeming to accelerate the delamination of what they call settler colonialism in the people. And it's when you're in deep engagement with landscapes and the organisms they're in, and even like rocks all the way to the stars and the starlight, all of those on a deeply authentic, holistic worldview, there's the immensity of possible new ways of thinking are just dazzling. And so that's what being involved with land conservation and activism and protecting the land. That's what I'm seeing, and it's a very deep philosophical perspective. But it's ancient. It's so ancient that it seems new, which is being the ne. So that's how NAS, and so NAS is a way to start to conceptualize and theorize what these new knowledges are.
Thank you, Mario. 1-800-996-2848. Listeners, that is the number if you would like to join our conversation. Maybe you have been a participant in a Native American Studies program, or you're interested in learning more about Native American Studies programs. Give us a call, 1-800-99-NATIVE. Our next guest, Kelly Nalani Beam. She is a PhD candidate in geography at the University of Kansas. And Kelly, what led you to pursue a Native American Studies program? And is there a specific path that you have a passion for?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this path actually started at a PWI in an agricultural economics program. I had taken a course on ag policy, and as the only Native student in the class, I was baffled when we began talking about the Dawes Act, and they kept talking about the Dawes Act as this foundational framework that changed the world and innovation in agriculture. And I was just shocked. I had to raise my hand and had to say, you're missing the truth behind this history. And I think what I really realized with that program was that I don't want to be in an institution where I am teaching in a classroom where I should be learning. And so from there, I received my undergrad in individualized studies and a minor in agricultural business management. But I knew when I was going to grad school, I had to find a program and a university that offered more. And so I'm super thankful for the Haskell Environmental Research Studies Institute that brought me to Lawrence, Kansas in the summer of 2022. And that program, on top of teaching me how to conduct and frame research in an Indigenous setting, it also offered me the opportunity to attend KU on a full ride scholarship. And so that was a huge transition for me. First, I met faculty and staff that were Indigenous, that had backgrounds in Indigenous studies and research. And then I knew there was the coursework. And also on top of that, we also have the Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership at KU. And those were things that were critically important to me because I knew that I could enter my research and kind of bypass all of the intro to American Indian Studies aspects and actually learn and actually apply. And so I think that having American Indian Studies or Indigenous Studies programs just really allows students to kind of get straight to work and not have to advocate.
Right. Kelly, we have to take a short break, but we're going to come back and we'll talk more. Listeners, stay with us.
Support by Sonosky Chambers Law, championing tribal sovereignty and Native American rights since 1976. From opioids litigation to treaty rights to tribal self-governance. With offices in Washington, D.C., New Mexico, California, and Alaska. Sonosky Chambers Law.
Need help identifying community priorities? Kaufman & Associates' approach to evaluation is rooted in Indigenous knowledge, honoring tribal history, and sovereignty. More at KaufmanInc.com, KAUFFMANINC.com.
This is Native America Calling. Let's continue our discussion with Indigenous scholars about the future of American Indian Studies. Listeners can join the conversation by calling 1-800-996-2848. That's also 1-800-99-NATIVE. One of our guests, Kelly Nalani Beam, is a PhD candidate at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, Kansas. And Kelly, before break, you said something that just really stuck with me. You said you didn't want to be in an environment, in a classroom, where you were having to teach when you should have been able to learn. You should have been learning instead. And that was just so powerful. And I think that really resonates with a lot of our listeners to hear a comment like that. And I know that data sovereignty is a focus of yours, and I'm interested in learning how you view that as a student and a researcher, all within the lens of Native American studies.
Of course, yeah. Well, data sovereignty is not a specific aspect of my research. It applies heavily to, I believe, anyone in Indigenous studies. One of my first kind of introductions to these concerns was actually while I was applying for research funding for my dissertation work. And what I realized was that in the fine print of many of these research grants was this clause about the ownership of the research and where that data would go. And it just didn't sit right for me. So I actually made a personal decision to ensure that I would only apply for research funding that allowed the ownership of my research to retain with myself, the researcher, or with the communities that I collaborate with. And I think this is really important because research funding should never be contractual in the sense of data sovereignty. And I think within that, it's really led me down this path of, considering what programs I'm using to transcribe my data and really looking at, does it feed into an open AI system, or how do I protect the stories and the information that I'm getting while on research? And I think it's a big conversation that we're seeing. KU recently had a data sovereignty conference, and next month we'll be having a conference on AI and what that means to tribal sovereignty. And so I think these conversations are really important, not just as individuals, but also as researchers in looking at how we protect and manage our data that we're collecting.
And Kelly, when you tell funders or other potential partners about your insistence that you have more ownership of your data, of your research, do you get any pushback on that?
No, I think it's a great conversation to have. You know, in one of our Indigenous science and methodology courses, we talked about the importance of data management plans and what that looks like. And I think the big thing is just maintaining transparency with tribal communities, but also ensuring that, you know, those R's of research in Indigenous communities are also being recognized. And that includes how we approach and we collect and store and eventually, you know, disseminate our data.
Now, you also have a focus on food sovereignty. Tell me more about that and how you want to use that work in communities that you ultimately serve.
Yeah, this is a question that I am concerned the episode here is not long enough. I could talk about this all day. But, you know, it really stems from the COVID-19 pandemic. I was in a fortunate position where I was working at a food bank distribution warehouse, and I was an essential employee that worked the entire pandemic, and I was confused at seeing the amount of food come into the warehouse, but our tribal partners that stopped coming. And what I really realized was that many of the programs and the commodity foods that we were receiving were from federal programs, but because some of our tribal nations were in multiple states or they were across a boundary of service, they weren't eligible for these programs. And so I really started diving deep into these policies and what it looked like. And that's where my undergrad research led to the food distribution program on Indian reservations. And it's the only program of the 16 that Food and Nutrition Services offers that has a prohibition on dual participation. And it just is mind-blowing to me because of all the other programs, SNAP or food stamps is one of the most successful nutrition assistance programs in our nation. And yet, if you're a tribal citizen receiving commodity foods from FDPIR, then you're automatically disqualified from SNAP. And ever since then, I've been on a mission to ensure equity in these programs. And I think one great example of that is the self-determination demonstration project that's currently going on in FDPIR. And while this program is only a pilot and the funding is only through 2026, I've really framed my entire research on really trying to find a way to advocate for these programs and ensure that not only does FDPIR and 638 become permanent, but that we can expand 638 or self-determination contracts across the USDA entirely.
Kelly, do you meet many other Native people interested in geography or perhaps already working as geographers?
You know, I still question sometimes how I got into geography, and originally my plan was to actually do a master's in Indigenous Studies and a dual degree with law school. But unfortunately, it was very hard to find funding, and I am so thankful for the geography department at KU that found me funding and allowed me the freedom to continue the work I was doing. Since being in this program, I've learned so much more about Indigenous geographies and the work being done in those capacities. And I think one of the things that just really makes me realize that this path was set for me is that geography is all about the land, and our place-based relations really highlight all of our culture, our ceremony, our languages. And so while I didn't choose geography, I feel like geography chose me. I think that there's a lot of application within Indigenous geographies to really highlight those place-based relations in any type of research.
It really sounds that way, Kelly. Just to have you describe the various interests that you have and the different academic pursuits you have, you just very comprehensive approach. This is wonderful that you're so successful in what you're doing. And I'd like to bring Suksavan back into the conversation because Suksavan, I mean, listening to Kelly, listening to Mario, listening to Allison, it just sounds like there are so many different ways that a student can apply Native studies, and this degree seems very versatile. How do you present Native studies programs to maybe undergrads or other people that are just kind of trying to figure out what they should pursue, what they should study, and kind of what's your pitch for young Native students with Native studies?
Yeah, this I was actually thinking about this as everyone was talking, because everyone brought up such great points and different things that they're studying that really stuck out to me in terms of the importance of Indigenous studies for Indigenous students, but I think non-Indigenous students as well. But specifically, I would say for us as Indigenous peoples, AIS or NAS or Indigenous studies is very critical in helping us as peoples, as relatives, understand the systems and our place currently, right? I think that sometimes as Indigenous peoples or people in the world, we think that things just happen coincidentally. But we know through AIS and NAS and Indigenous studies that what we have gone through is intentional and by design through a settler colonial system that has created law and policies to force us into boarding schools, force us into signing treaties in a very particular way, forcing gender, forcing all of these different types of colonial concepts onto our bodies that we live with today, right? And so if we want to think about a decolonial future or an anti-colonial future, we must first understand our relationship with ourselves and the relationship to the system, to a system of power, to combat it, right? I think oftentimes I see people who talk about the traumas that we've endured and not realizing that may have been a trauma from boarding school, right? Or a trauma from generations of people who have been forcefully displaced or terminated or relocated. And so I think these are very critical aspects of our lives that we don't really talk about or have discussions in our own personal lives. I'm sure some of us do, but I think in our day-to-day lives, we're not talking about like the Relocation Act of the 1950s, which I usually do, right? But I think it's important that these are happening in a classroom setting where they can apply it to, students can apply it to your own personal life. And I always see a light bulb moment when students are like, that is what happened. And I kind of want to talk about like my own experience. My grandpa would always talk about Chicago. And I was like, why is he talking about Chicago, right? Or about my mom being in foster care, later to find out that my grandpa was relocated in the 60s to Chicago during the relocation era, right? And so this is applicable to my life and the impacts that it has on us. Later finding out that my mom was taken by the Indian Placement Program. And so all of these different types of programs, policy, et cetera, are important to understand for us as Indigenous peoples and get to the root of like, these are all systems of power of settler colonialism that has aimed to assimilate, erase, and eradicate indigeneity. And so how do we begin to understand those systems to do the scholarship that we're doing? And I think the 3 PhD candidate students are doing fabulous work in AIS and NAS that I think is what we are striving for. What as professors we want to see is them thinking critically about how to engage and combat these systems and how do we survive in these systems too, right? We have to unfortunately live in these. But I think that would be my pitch, is like that we as Indigenous peoples have a very unique relationship and history with this nation. And we have to understand what that is in order to understand ourselves as people, to understand our gender, to understand our personhood, to understand our relationship to land, right? After we understand and I think experience AIS or NAS or Indigenous studies, it's helped me understand myself. And I'm sure it's helped the other folks in this space understand themselves too, to be like, wow, I do feel a little more grounded in the work that I'm doing. And I have a reason for doing it, right? Because we don't get told about these histories. So I think that would be my pitch, is that I think we learn a lot from our own personal, that there is a tie that we have with this stuff.
Sukhsavan, PhD candidates, doctorates, obviously that's a focus of what we're talking about today. But what about other Native students, maybe not interested in pursuing doctorates, but just undergrads or even people in grad school? Would you recommend every Native student at some point take a few Native American studies courses? Because there's so many different areas they can, Native literature, history, law, and policy. There's a lot of different angles they can pursue.
Yes, 1,000%. I would say all students should be taking an Indigenous Studies course. Of course, I think with the point of what we can do with it, but I think it's so applicable as we've seen through the conversation today. There's so much that we can understand. So, for example, if we think about law and stuff, I think understanding federal Indian policy, federal Native American law and policy, etc., is important for lawyers to learn. I think for everyday today life, it is very important because whether people like it or not, the United States is Indigenous land, right? And so is what we now know as Canada and what we now know as Mexico, etc. Like these places are and were and are Indigenous lands that were forcibly taken through genocide and dispossession, right? That we all, Indigenous or not, have an obligation to Indigenous peoples as we currently reside, live, having families, building things on Indigenous lands where we had generations of histories here, right, of relationships here, and that was all taken away through genocide and dispossession, as I said. And I think we as peoples today in 2026 have an obligation to Indigenous peoples for that. And so I think everyone should be taking a class and learning their place and their position in a settler colonial regime and what its design is.
All right. Mario Atencio, I want to go back to you as we begin to wind down the show. And I'm hearing Native American studies, I'm hearing American Indian studies, and there seems to be a little bit of a transition here in terms of how do we refer to this field of research, this field of education, this field of scholarship. What do you prefer, Mario? How do you like to refer to it?
Let's see, it's a little political in Native American studies, in the Native American studies program, but it's part of a larger international Indigenous studies perspective. Whereas I think on the international level, they look at what we can define locally within our in our places, what the issues that we think, especially with our special relationship with the United States, and maybe the here in New Mexico relationship with like Spanish law, and how that's shaped our world views, and then take those up to an international process. I think that's sort of what some of the initial scholars like Linda Smith has created. So sometimes they're not interchangeable necessarily, but Native American studies and American Indian, we have to always remember that we're still considered American Indian / Alaskan Natives. That's the federal moniker that they have on us, and so American Indian is very focused on that really false history, but it actually defines the field in itself is that it does, you do have to talk about treaties and agreements in that space. Well, internationally, Indigenous peoples, they don't necessarily have those treaties and agreements or such that we have here, and that's either good or bad, and that depends on how and why you're discussing. So.
All right. Well, we're going to have to wrap up this conversation. I wish we could talk more. It's been wonderful, but we are out of time. Big thanks to our 4 guests who joined us: Mario Atencio, Dr. Suksavan Kiavorabuth, Allison Shaddux, and Kelly Nalani Beam. And please join us again tomorrow for another riveting discussion about an Indigenous issue or topic. I am your host, Sean Spruce. Enjoy the rest of your day. You've been listening to the one, the only, Native America Calling.
The faculty of tribal colleges and universities support their students in countless ways. They say I believe and offer help before it's asked.
Hear that? That's everything tribal college faculty do for their students on Fast Forward. Because if one tried to say it in real time, they'd be here all day. They teach, guide, comfort, and connect. And for that, the community is grateful. Learn more at mostthoroughdjobdescription.com. The American Indian College Fund supports this program.
They give extensions, cheer progress, share laughter, create calm, and allow reflection. They inspire hope, share wisdom, guide gently, validate healing.
Who protects Indian country? Ameren does. As the only 100% tribally owned insurance carrier, Amerant helps strengthen tribal communities by providing reliable insurance coverage and keeping dollars in Indian country. From property and liability to commercial auto and tribal workers' compensation, Amerant is here to protect what matters. Celebrating 40 years of serving Indian country. Learn more at Amerant.com. That's AMERIND.com.
Native America Calling is produced in the Annenberg National Native Voice Studios in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation, a Native nonprofit media organization. Funding is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting with support from the Public Radio Satellite Service. Music is by Brent Michael Davids. Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.